Hello everyone and welcome to this Facebook Live. My name is Adam Soos. You probably know that by now if you're following my page. And beside me is a man who needs no introduction, but I'll allow him to introduce himself.
I'm Brad Trost. I'm a Member of Parliament from Saskatoon, Conservative leadership candidate. Known for a few things. It's interesting, before this leadership race in Saskatchewan I was known for energy policy, mining. I'm a geophysicist by trade. Most people in this leadership campaign have known me as someone who's fairly outspoken in what he believes. Social conservative issues are definitely a part of my campaign, but also things like privatizing the CBC and my rather firm stance on the subject of carbon taxes, climate change, have also been a part of my campaign. Personal note, I'm married to a wonderful gal by the name of Geralt. No, that's not an English Anglo-Saxon name, she's Mongolian. And I'm the dad to the cutest 2-year-old in the whole wide world, and her name is Isabel. So I'm happy to be here today to answer your questions, to talk about a variety of things. Nothing's off limit. I remember when I was in a grade 5 class once in my riding, and the two questions the kids wanted to know were, what is my salary and are you married? And I answered both of them. So whatever you've got, let's have a good Facebook Live session.
Great. So I will be tracking Facebook Live for questions. I see we've got quite a few people watching live right now. So go ahead with those questions. We're going to watch them closely. Maybe as those questions start to come in, talk a little bit about the constituency you represent and some of the work you've done there.
Sure. I represent an area in Saskatoon known as Saskatoon University, because the University of Saskatchewan is geographically located at the heart of the riding. My boundaries have changed over the last few times, but it's a bit interesting because when people think of me, they think of Mr. Social Conservative. They wouldn't think that I represent a riding that's a university, a lot of university professors. Those historically have been sort of demographics which have been hard for conservatives to reach out to. I've never had a problem with that. We campaign aggressively in the university dorms. We won them again in this last election. We've done that before. So it's not considered a big deal for me to win the younger vote, and we get a very similar share as we do in the riding as a whole. People think of Saskatchewan as a bunch of Europeans who immigrated in the 1920s. We actually have a much more multicultural, more of a Toronto feel than people actually realize. Not by any stretch of the imagination are we a Toronto or Vancouver, but we do have an increasing number of new Canadians and visible minority Canadians who are in the community. Again, they tend to trend conservative in my riding more than they would in other parts of the country. I have some fairly good relationships with them. But other than that, upper middle class, not wealthy, but better income than most people, and houses are less expensive, so people's standards of living are relatively high based upon the Canadian standards.
Perfect, and that transitions into this next question in part anyways fairly well. So Colette is asking, what are your thoughts on property rights and gun rights?
Hey, I am a strong supporter of property rights. I'll give kudos. Another candidate came out with a policy proposal on it. It's an excellent idea. Having the provinces actually put them in through their own legislation through a direct one-to-one amending formula with the federal government. So strongly in favor of that. When it comes to firearms rights, let me put it this way. One of the firearms groups said the only reason Brad Trost wasn't their first pick and he was their second pick was they figured my agenda was too ambitious to get through Parliament. So I got cursed by being too pro-firearms. We've got some very good proposals. We want to scrap what's left of C-68. That's something the party promised to do in 2004, and then subtly changed it in 2006 to only scrap the long gun registry. I don't think that was the right move. We should have scrapped the entirety of C-68, the Allen Rock legislation. A couple other unique things on my firearms policy. So that would mean going back to the old FAC system, things of that nature. One of the things I want to actually also put in legislation is to allow police officers, assuming their departments permit them, to carry their firearms off duty. That's something that I think would actually add to security. I mean, we train these guys as full-scale professionals. You don't lose your professionalism when you're off the clock as a police officer. So that would actually be a security initiative. Ease to transport, I've got some proposals on that. going forward. So a variety of things. My webpage has a 7-point plan. In fact, the guy who I worked with closely to put this together was the staffer for Gary Breitkreitz, the MP who was in charge of it. So I have literally the country's best policy expert on this, endorsing and working for my campaign. So as someone who owns a 270 Savage and a 12-gauge Remington, I have an interest in this.
Awesome. Perfect. I just picked up my first restricted firearm 2 days ago, and it is a rigmarole, so I think cleaning some of that up is definitely beneficial. You said nothing was off limits, so we've got a zinger here from Mel. Mel asks, or mentions, that the UN just added a Saudi man in charge of women's issues. What's your thoughts about What's your thoughts about the UN and about the new add of a Saudi male in charge of women's issues as well? What's your perspective on globalist versus nationalist things? I remind you, share this video far and wide, get your questions in, we'll get to as many as we can. But
I think my first reaction to that is the United Nations has a really good sense of humor, or a really bad sense of humor, regardless how that's just a bizarre thing. I guess the upside is, if there's someone who could learn and improve, this is the best where you can go. I'm not a fan of the United Nations. I actually think it was a mistake, and I think if you talk to him now, he would say so himself when Stephen Harper campaigned for a position on the Security Council. Because what you then tend to start doing is catering to the little dictators and thugs and the corrupt bureaucrats who run that organization. So my foreign policy would be to pull back from them. I don't think, for practical reasons, we can completely disengage, but I think we need to turn down the funding, start to cut the organizational money off of them, and re-engage on one-to-one with our major allies. Great Britain, I mean, look, not for my place to say what they should do, but I would have voted with the out people had I been there. Okay. Free trade agreements with them, things like that we need to do. So yeah, I'm not a fan of whatever you want to call the pro-United Nations globalists. They have tended to push over the years a left-wing big government agenda, and they've tended to do it in an internationalist formula, which makes it even worse than the independent nation states when they try to push big governments. Okay.
And then, so thanks a lot for that question, Mel. And then on the last note of kind of the globalist versus nationalist kind of angle, do you have any commentary or thoughts on that?
I would say that's somewhat of a simplification. Look, to me, it's always, is it big government or is it small government? If you are a free trader for trade agreements all over the world, the question is this: are you taking government down or making them bigger? Now, some of these trade agreements are to put more restrictions to help certain companies. Okay. That helps big government. But if it's classical free trade, which means breaking down trade barriers between individuals by limiting the powers of government, 100% in favor of that. Because remember, trade is between individuals, not between nations. Indeed. And so my goal is simple: get the state out of your pocketbook, and it doesn't matter if it's inside the country or between countries, and that will work.
Okay, good. Now, another question here from Pearlie. She asks, if you become leader, will you include other leadership candidates as part of your team, or will you collaborate with other leadership candidates?
Yes.
Okay. Who? No, I'm just joking.
Look, if you want to have a pretty good idea of where I overlap with other candidates, not perfectly, because you have some differences. I think everyone knows me on social issues. Me and Pierre Lemieux, very, very similar. On economic issues, me and Maxime Bernier have an awful lot of overlap. Stephen Blaney and I tend to see law and order and security issues very much similar. We've talked about notwithstanding clauses and things like that. So I could probably look at some others. Like I said, there's individual issues. Like Andrew Saxton, I like his idea about apprenticeships being brought into the system. So there's little things like that. But basically, probably my heaviest overlap would be Bernier on economics, Lemieux on social issues, and Blaney on sort of justice issues. Okay. That would be my heaviest overlap. And
despite different approaches, you would be willing to work with people to work on issues.
I can get along with. It's interesting. I have really not chased endorsements in this campaign. Because my viewpoint is, if you're going to endorse me, you have to fundraise a certain number, you have to work. I just don't want you to slap a bumper sticker up. I'm actually getting support from other MPs who have endorsed other candidates. We had one who was telling me his candidate wasn't selling memberships, so they shipped over a list to us to get memberships sold. And we've got that with probably 3 of the other campaigns right now, where their people were sort of throwing second ballot and different stuff our direction that we didn't even ask for. So yeah, I get along fairly well with, if not the entire field, as good as the entire field. So.
Okay. Now another question here, and I know I'm going to add a little bit to this question though from Doug. Doug's very concerned about the propaganda in the schools, what they're feeding the students. He mentions a few things, an over kind of bearing emphasis on global warming. I know specifically though from an Alberta perspective, some of these sex ed curriculums that are being pushed in the schools, as well as recently, I'm not sure if you followed with our wonderful education minister, David Eggen. There was graphic content being shared, graphic sexual content being shared with elementary school students, and he thought that was okay. But when a Catholic school had a presentation that was not pro-abortion, he thought that that had no place in public education whatsoever. So I know there's a lot of concerns about independent rights for parents and parental education rights.
Yes, I've got a policy idea on this one. I talked with a law professor friend of mine, and we came up with this idea, essentially borrowing the idea of conscience legislation for doctors and people like that. And we call it a parental bill of rights, because under the Canadian Constitution, you can have civil liberties and they are protected by the federal government. So, and this is based upon previous court rulings, the federal government could pass legislation that says parents have the right to protect their children from things that are against their morals, against their religious values, etc., even if it's put forward by another level of government. So, what you would then have is the school system would then have to be required to get permission from the parents if the school system was pushing something that was against the parents' morals. So, I mean, and even people could do it because sometimes it's age-level appropriate stuff and things of that nature.
Of course.
So, because people have always asked me, they understand the difference between federal and provincial jurisdiction, and you can't get into it.
Yeah.
But this actually, because it's about civil liberties protection, the federal government can do it.
Has a role.
Because I understand some of the provinces of the country, Alberta, you guys may get your problems fixed here provincially. Okay?
Yes, yeah.
You may learn not to elect new Democrats like we did in Saskatchewan. But some of the provinces in the country may not get there. I think at the federal level, this is something that could be done to protect the rights of children and parents. So that's one way I found a creative way to help people who actually need help protecting themselves from big government interfering in their children's lives.
Awesome, great. So really quickly, I just want to give a quick shout out to Around the Bend. We're in southeast Calgary. It's a wonderful sandwich pretzel shop. They've got fantastic food. They give us lunch for free today. Really took care of us. Here's a glimpse of our
here's the
half-eaten sandwich. So here's some advertisement for Around the Bend. Thank you so much to Rob for hosting us. So that's outstanding, so thank you. We'll get into the next question right away here. And this one is one that I'm sure you've probably heard before, and you will no doubt hear again, but what are your thoughts on supply management?
Yeah, I'm a little bit, people have divided everyone into Bernier and the rest of the field. That's not quite accurate. I'm actually the one guy who, how shall we put this, is in the middle, okay? I'll be honest, if you do what Bernier has, you have to find $30 billion somewhere. Yeah. He's talking about putting a tax on milk and things like that. That's going to be both politically painful and fiscally painful.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
But I do understand and get his whole point about it costs consumers and so forth. It's not something we would implement. Steve Blaney and the others who are saying never, 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 never change, yeah, well, welcome to the real world. That's not going to happen. And frankly, it's in the interest of the farmers and consumers for them to be gradual changing. But if you're a young guy who's just paid $2 million in quota, okay, you have to get paid out. It's not your fault that you had to pay into the racket to get there.
Yeah.
So my position's actually in between the two of them, that we start to do gradual change. This is based on suggestions of the Fraser Institute, free market guys, that you start to do gradual change by increasing your export market outside and a division and in dairy and poultry outside the supply management, and you start to gradually grow that as you start to make gradual changes to begin to wind down, because inevitably this is going to happen. So rather than putting a big tax on to pay for this thing or completely wiping it out, you begin to make a gradual change, because $30 billion is really hard for any finance minister to change.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I have news. For 12, 13, 14,000 farmers, when it comes to dealing with the United States and trade issues and stuff, this is not going to last forever, guys. So you need to figure out a way to evolve. And frankly, I think regardless who wins this leadership race, my approach is going to be one that both sides have to somewhat come to.
Okay.
Because there's the theory, and I'm actually dealing with the reality.
Okay. Awesome.
So I'm the one guy in the middle on this issue.
Okay. So another question that we have here from John, and I'm going to add a little bit to it as well. He mentions basic income. He discusses basic income. So I'll get your thoughts on basic income, but also I know in Alberta they're talking about this $15 minimum wage.
Yeah.
And I know for a small business like the one we're visiting right now, if they were to kind of force that sort of income for entry-level employees who are just kind of starting out, that could cripple a business completely. So whether it be basic income or a minimum wage that's inflated in most people's eyes, what are your thoughts on that?
Let me start by telling a story. One of the ways I put my way through university was by working in a bakery, 4 a.m. to 12 noon. Did that to save up some money. And during that time in Saskatchewan, they raised the minimum wage. So you know what the employer of my business did after they raised the minimum wage? He cut my hours and made me do basically the same work. So instead of finishing at 12 noon every day, my job ended at 11:30, but I worked to 11:50.
Yeah.
My coffee break. So you know what it did for me? Zero.
Mm-hmm.
I got absolutely nothing from it.
Yeah.
That was a real world. Now, their business, it was a small bakery, not a chain or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It was difficult. I
Yeah.
get that. So I actually understood that. You know, I wasn't there for a life career. But that taught me one very thing. If you're going to raise the minimum wage
Yeah.
to help people like the situation I was in,
Yeah.
didn't help me at all.
No.
I made all of zero, did the same hours, and
Yeah.
they just worked around it. And if they'd raised it a little bit more, they would have shut the bakery
Exactly,
down.
yeah.
That helped. So that's my opinion on this. The minimum wage, the minimum income. So it's a provincial decision, but by and large, minimum wage hikes don't help the people they're intended to.
No.
Okay, that's didn't help me. Okay, this whole minimum income idea, I'm not quite sure what's getting at that, because we currently have welfare. We currently have effectively, even if it's put into 3 or 4 different pots, at the provincial level, there's a minimum income depending what you have.
Yeah.
Now, if they just want to reorganize it to make it simple, okay, have at it. That's the provincial governments to do. They tend to do it, and that's just an administrative thing to simplify people's benefits. That might be a good idea, but to guarantee a higher level of welfare for everyone, I think that that's going to discourage people from working.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I've observed, aid from the private sector, churches, charities, etc., tends to be a lot more able to tell when people are loafing or when they're actually in need of help.
And there's less bureaucracy, less
There's
waste.
less bureaucracy,
all
less
that.
waste. You see this in the refugee system all the time. They're huge.
Yeah. We have
So
my church has a number of Syrian families that we
That's
take
right.
care of.
And they're doing a better job
Well,
than the
of
ones-
course. Yeah, exactly.
So the whole minimum income thing, I'm not quite sure what it's doing, because there is effectively welfare and other things out there. So if it's to get rid of bureaucracy, okay.
Yeah.
But it's a provincial government thing. But if it's to up the level of welfare benefits, that's going to cause some problems.
For sure. Okay, here's another hot button issue that we've basically every time I've done a video on this. Last time we were on with Andrew Shear, he discussed this. So definitely a hot button issue. This is from D. Kranz. If you were to become PM, Prime Minister, would you reverse and or remove M103? And would you introduce limits on federal money being sent out of country, enforce borders and limit the influx of refugees, or would you ban sanctuary cities? I know it's a lot of questions.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
M103,
M103
absolutely
first.
opposed to. No
Yeah.
ifs, ands, buts, or maybes, okay?
So completely revoke, remove.
Completely opposed.
Yeah.
No ifs, ands, or buts, or maybes.
Correct answer.
Yeah, I actually do an explanation as to how this will work and what it will do.
Yeah.
So completely opposed. I was opposed to the petition, opposed to everything. Sanctuary cities, that's just a silly idea. We don't need that. On the border, one of the things my campaign was the first one to suggest was what they're using coming from the States now is a loophole in our laws caused by a 1985 court decision.
Mm-hmm.
Parliament has not had the guts to overturn that decision. We could do it by invoking what's known as the notwithstanding clause.
Yeah.
And I said this a few months ago, and we are adamant on that. You need to reverse this court decision that was made in 1985. That closes the loophole, because if people are sneaking around the borders, they shouldn't have more rights than if they go right through the borders.
For sure.
So block it off that way. Okay, a couple of the other questions. What were they?
With regarding just putting a limit on federal money being sent out of country.
If there
So
needs, if
Trudeau's massive kind of checks he sends off to arbitrary countries.
Look, I am not a fan. You look at his $2.5 billion on climate change money that he's sending overseas. My first question when I heard about that is, which African dictator gets the money first, and to which Swiss bank account it goes? People can guess with my social conservative views what I think about overseas funding for abortion.
Yeah.
I led the fight to get it changed in the Harper government.
Yeah.
I was the guy that got the petition going, that harassed the government, that eventually got it done.
Yeah.
So absolutely on that. And the other thing, and this is interesting, my wife has done some work over the years with foreign aid stuff, handling and so forth, and so I know a few number of those people. A lot of well-intentioned waste.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. And I talked with some of our former parliamentary secretary who lost her seat last time. She would travel around the world and just come back, and it was like, yeah. So there's a lot of our foreign aid budget which is complete and utter waste, or going to help political values, viewpoints that I don't agree with. So happily helps me to balance the budget when I'm Prime Minister.
Awesome. So on that note, one of the questions we have here from Lucas is it possible for the abortion debate to be opened in Canada again? And how do you intend to do that?
Yes. In fact, from my perspective, it's never been closed. I've said there's a few things you can do as Prime Minister right off the top. First of all, you implement a couple things that are in party policy. You begin to work on that. You do something on the gender selection abortion. That's Conservative Party policy. You bring in the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. Again, Conservative Party policy. Technically not abortion, but closely related. I've said you start to use the power of your office as Prime Minister to do things positive. So my health minister would get a mandate letter that says you need to do things to find ways to promote and protect the value of life. Examples I've given, do things to defend and educate people to protect the rights of unborn children who have Down syndrome. That's just an example. Try to figure out how to make Canada literally the most pro-adoption country in the world. Give supports to women and people in crisis pregnancies. Those are things that my health minister would have in his or her mandate letter. So those are things that we could all do, even with a minority Conservative government.
Yeah.
Because if I had an overwhelming majority, massive control of the Senate, Supreme Court, yeah, I would go all the way.
Yeah.
No one doubts that about me, and I would. But I've tried to figure out things that we could do in a minority situation, a majority situation, and then in a situation where we can go all the way.
Okay.
So if a politician tells you you cannot do anything on this issue, they just don't want to try. Okay? Because there's a lot of things that are popular, even with people who don't describe themselves as pro-life in our positions, that you can bring them on side. When I talk about palliative care for euthanasia, people go, yeah, that we should have more of that.
Yeah.
Because once people realize there's another option out there, you undercut support for the other side. And I'm willing to do that along with concrete legislative measures, because it's like going into war. You just don't have infantry. You have all sorts of Air Force, Navy, and so forth. You're going to win a battle, and you need to use honey, not just vinegar.
Exactly. Well, I mean, and there are practical measures. Sometimes when you talk about just abortion facts in Canada, people don't know the basic facts. You mentioned that it's legal for all 9 months, for example, and people don't know that you have to show them the law, and then they don't believe you until that point. So they're definitely kind of measured points that everyone can agree to, that we can take steps forward. So,
and this is one thing I think people should be knowing. If caucus knows they have a Prime Minister who truly cares about this issue, I've been in politics long enough, MPs will do all sorts of things to try to be favorable with the boss on his or her favorite issue. So that's one of the things that this would have a huge impact on the voting of sort of the people who are on both sides of the fence.
Awesome. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Oh, absolutely.
Great, perfect. So, will you ensure that our RCMP officers have the resources they need to do their jobs and to get home safe after their shift? Things like body cams, dash cams are not commonly used in RCMP. These can be crucial to protecting the officer from unjust charges being brought against them for doing their job.
Yeah, I have a relative who's a member of the RCMP. He got sort of left out to, I should be careful on this, but he got sort of hung out there to dry on something he shouldn't have ever been, and so I understand exactly where that's coming from. I don't exactly know the budget situation of the RCMP right now, but if I get that sort of information from active or retired members, I think an immediate review to see what extra funding the RCMP needs should be put in ASAP.
Okay, so there's some mention here about your kind of perspective on personal privacy, big data. There's even some concerns with Bill C-51, which is a big thing Trudeau campaigned on, and then he only doubled down and did significantly more. He didn't retract anything, which is one of the things. I know lots of people during that campaign, one of their concerns was Bill C-51, which lots of people didn't find terribly concerning. Okay. But what's your kind of stance with so much of our information being available online? And so much of that information being accessible, how do you protect personal rights?
Yeah, I honestly don't know a lot about the whole technological aspects of it. I will say this, I trust big business about as much as I trust big government with my privacy.
Yeah.
How that actually works into legislation, I don't know, because every time you turn around and you're new and learning something, there's some new technology about how you can link different ways in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't like the fact that if I click on something to figure out something, I may get a phone call the next day from a company that's linked that. It could be totally innocuous things. When you have health issues online and you go online to research something, mm-hmm. you don't want some marketer calling the next day because you were trying to figure out about your mother-in-law's cancer.
Yeah.
Okay? There's nothing in some ways to hide, but it still should be kept private. So how it's implemented, yeah, I tend to have a libertarianish streak on that sort of thing.
Okay.
When in doubt, err on the side of privacy.
So don't pass any policies to enable companies or anything
no,
to do this more.
Look, I'll be blunt. I don't like the whole the CRA gets access to everyone's tax data everywhere. I know it's popular for all the governments to try to close tax loopholes around the world, mm-hmm. tax shelters around the world. I think it's good there's a few tax shelters around the world that the government can't actually find. Now, I'm not using them, don't have the money, don't have the ability, but there should be some places in the world where people can go hide out. I know people say, well, it's just the bad guys. No. If you come from parts of the world where the government's corrupt and confiscates everything, and frankly, some of our governments in this country have that attitude too, mm-hmm. I think there is good places to hide. You have your money, and it belongs to you, and too many times the government think you only get to borrow it from them.
For sure. Okay, another good question that we have here, again, I think it's from D. I think we've answered one question from D already, but we'll take another one. Would you place limits on the personal spending of taxpayers' money by the PM? And they make reference to Trudeau's extensive vacations and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty easy. There's no way Brad Trost will ever get to spend anywhere as close. We'll find what the limit is. Okay, Trudeau has, what, a $15,000 watch? I need to upgrade, but this one was bought at Costco for like I forget whatever Costco pays.
So we'll go to Walmart after and get you a nice new one.
Yes, awesome. I was joking with one of the New Democrats because at the last election we had pretty much a new board and she had a new board, and we were saying, maybe we could divert our MP expenses to hire nannies in our offices. What would taxpayers say? And we both laughed because we know it's totally, utterly ridiculous.
Of course.
Look, the Trudeau Liberal's entitled to his entitlements, and they figure your money is theirs to flaunt.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome. So I think we'll probably wrap up pretty soon. We've been going for a little while now. I'll just allow you to kind of close with a bit of a commentary. First off, I guess, why people should be voting for you over other candidates, and what your first kind of action items would be. What would you do if you were to win? What would your first
as party leader or as prime minister?
As prime minister.
Okay, I'll make the pitch. Why vote for Brad Trost? Because Brad Trost is consistent. He says the same thing in one part of the country as in another, in both languages. What's that consistency? He's socially conservative. No one doubts that. He's upfront. He's honest about that. He's fiscally conservative. Never met a tax he didn't want to cut or an expenditure he didn't want to try to save a few bucks on. And he's democratic. He understands where to go. You've heard all that, but what you need to know is I can win, and I actually bring people into the Conservative Party that other people don't. My campaign is really popular among new Canadians. Why? One of the reasons is the social conservative aspects that I bring to the table. My wife's from Asia. I've got family members from around the world. Those people are small C conservatives who haven't been voting for our party. When you look at other candidates, Aaron O'Toole's a great guy, but he doesn't bring in any new demographic, GTA people. Andrew Scheer's a nice guy, but rural Saskatchewan already votes for us. New Canadians don't. I can actually bring them in. Chinese Canadians, Filipino Canadians, other groups like that. I have connections, I have background. So I'm a better candidate for the general election than a lot of these other candidates are. It's why we've sold way more memberships than some of the other campaigns out there. That's one thing you need to know. What would I do as Prime Minister? I explained this to one person before. When you become Prime Minister, it's as if you have a few different boxes from you. You have a social box, a national security box, you have a fiscal box, and I'm trying to remember what my fourth one was. But you select items from each of them. For my fiscal box, number one thing to do would be tax reform. That means doing things like a comprehensive overhaul of our income tax rates to make sure everyone has a tax cut for the first 2 years at a minimum, making it simpler, making it fairer, eliminating things like any sort of chance of carbon tax, bringing down business taxes, things of that. So in the fiscal, economic, the number one priority is taking care of reform of the tax code. On national security, rebuilding our Navy and our Air Force equipment lots. I'm a big supporter of the armed forces. I want to make the reserves the same size as our regular forces. I want to bring in an overseas foreign intelligence service similar to MI6. But the number one thing we need to do is rebuild the equipment on some of the large-scale projects that need to be done. So that would be from my national security box. For my social conservative box, what would be my number one priorities? I talked about the mandate letter that I would give to my health minister. That would be the first thing I would do. It would demonstrate to the broader community that we care and that we have compassion, that we're actually there fighting for the weakest in our society, and that we would actually try to get things done as quick as possible. Legislation can sometimes take years, but if you start to change people's hearts and minds as you prepare the legislation, you can do these things, 1, 2, 3. So those are the three things that I would combine as Prime Minister. There would be others going down from each of those boxes and categories, but those would be things that I would select from those. Something that I feel personally about, something that would grow our economy, and something that provides for our long-term national security. Those would be my priorities.
Awesome. So how can people find more information on you? How can people get in touch if they want to support you? What can people do if they're on board?
bradforleader.ca or votez pour Brad.ca, ma français, un site de web en français aussi. But you can go to either website and we take donations. We are doing things to get people out. If you haven't bought a membership, it's too late, unfortunately. But if you do know someone who's a party member, get them to pay attention to some of the things. We have a really strong first ballot support, but you need to talk to people who are maybe voting for other candidates and say, take a look at this Trost guy. He's got extensive experience on trade, on natural resources. He was the party's foreign policy critic for the United States. You know that I'm a strong social conservative. You need to know that I can win and I bring new people into the party that others don't, and that people should think about me for their second and third ballot preference. Because what we're looking at in this race is probably 5 or 6 rounds before this election is done. bradtrostforleader.ca.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on. Merci beaucoup. For everyone, we're going to have this video in a couple hours. It's going to be on at adamsoos.com, so you'll be able to watch the video again. I'm sure Brad will probably be sharing it as well. Thanks again to Around the Bend for hosting us, and thanks for watching. Catch you next time.